Hi, Kimya. I'm so excited to have you here on the podcast. This is an absolute thrill for me. And we kind of connected almost by happenstance. And now we are here talking for the first time. So I am really thrilled to get to know you and to learn more about your history and your story. And so let's just start right there. I know you work a lot in this diversity and inclusion space, which is extremely popular these days. And so tell me about your journey there. Where did you start and kind of how did you get to where you are now?
Thank you so much for having me here, Anthony. I really appreciate this. And so I started in this space decades before there was an actual space, before there were acronyms, before people were profiting from this, before there were offices in schools supposedly dedicated to this. And that's also part of why I built this business over the decade, because I really just got tired of scammers and moneymakers. So my work is based on centuries of Indigenous, African, Black work, activism, scholarship. And it started off me being a Black girl born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, second capital of the Confederacy, and being a product of predominantly Black Richmond public schools. And if it was not for my parents, who are both Black educators, my brothers and I would not know half the things that we know, because the school 100%, and that's across the nation and most of the world, where everything is based on white people's version of everything. So you can literally finish K through 12, you can finish college, you can even get a PhD. And you believe that white people invented most of the, at least most important sciences and mathematics, arts, literatures. And when you're reading books, it's mostly white authors. And even if these are Indigenous, Black, Aboriginal, Asian, and non-white, Latin, non-white Hispanic authors, when you go to the reference page, it's usually mostly white people, because that's how the white publishers are around the world. And so there are people who are teaching this to every generation, K through 12, college, universities, medical schools, and all that. Mm-hmm. So me being a product of schools that just kept perpetuating that. Eventually, I remember in undergraduate when my friends and I started speaking out more, because we wanted to challenge what was being taught, what was being learned, what was being considered normal. And this tendency for Black students who are non-compliant to be sent to the minority office, all that nonsense, the tokenism. So just more and more, I just pulled back to what my parents, who are Black educators, taught us to learn. We were raised to watch Tony Brown's Journal. Anyone interested in learning about one of the best Black journalists, you can go to TonyBrownsJournal.com. We had to watch the news. That's also back when BET, Black Entertainment Television, actually had news as well. And so all of that shapes the work that I do now, because when I got into college, I started also challenging traditionalism, traditional notions of gender, traditional notions of sexuality, and learning more about thousands of years of sexualities, asexualities, genders, non-genders, and just everything that comprises us as people for thousands of years around the world. And that also challenges traditional religions. And so I just learned more and more about that as I got older, challenging this notion of sin and all that stuff. And this is also what I teach for students and communities. If you're really into equity, it can't just be one type of equity. Like, it can't be Black justice without comprising everything within us. So like, I also have a disability, I have a brain condition. So you can't be pro-Black, for example, and Pan-African without being pro-disability services. So with all of that shaping, it led up to me, after I finished my PhD in 2010, I became faculty. I created an academic program for almost 10 years. I was in charge of coordinating the program, choosing materials, hiring faculty, assessing faculty. It's a crime program, so unfortunately, I did recruitment for police. So some of my former students are police, and I'm against police now. But at that time, I was very much, especially connecting police with underserved identities. And of course, we know that being Black police, being LGBTQIA police does not change police. Okay, I'll just let people know that. So one thing when I still lived in North Carolina and I was still full-time faculty is I used to always criticize these diversity trainings and DEI offices. When something becomes popular, just know that it's not the origins of the purpose.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's even when underserved people are the ones in charge of it, because the underserved people get their jobs and keep their jobs by appeasing white people, appeasing men, appeasing cisgender, heterosexual, USA Christians, able health people. Like those of us who are outraging the power majority are not the ones getting paid $50,000 to do this work, because the power majority is not going to ever have you for a book club if you're really challenging them. So when I still was faculty, I was just always criticizing this stuff, like in faculty meetings. These faculty were saying some really dumb things. The white faculty were saying some really dumb things. And like even at conferences. And so eventually I spoke up, and this is before I got tenure. So I was speaking up before I got tenured associate, which is very risky for Black faculty in particular, because most Black faculty in USA are not tenure track and never become tenure track. So here I was right before I got tenure challenging white faculty who were senior faculty who would determine my tenure. So eventually somebody told me, they're like, Dr. Dennis, you criticize this diversity stuff a lot. Like no matter how people painted it, when I went to all these different trainings and communities and everywhere, they were mostly white led and including white liberal led. And it was all based on telling me, Kimya, you're going to be the only Black person, but I promise you, there's more to it than it seems. When you have to tell me there's more to it than it seems, that means there's not more to it.
No,
if it's
that's
not
a red
obvious,
flag.
Right? If it's not obvious, this is like centuries of Indigenous and Black people in particular being told to just keep hope alive, and eventually white people will make changes. So eventually someone just told me, Kimya, you need to be doing consulting work. And eventually that turned into 365 diversity. So, because I was like the complainer. So now I'm the complainer on behalf of 365 diversity.
Yes. And financing a business in the process. And I think that's absolutely amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I always tell people, if everyone is happy with what you're saying, that means the power majorities and the decision makers who are messing everything up are not being challenged.
Yeah.
Like if they're smiling, if you're talking about changing school curriculum and the school officials are excited, that means that they know they're not going to change anything. And so you have to find a way to stop pretending that collaboration means contributing to the nonsense that keeps going on and on and on.
Absolutely. And benefiting from the nonsense that keeps going on and on and on.
Yes, there are people who are making a lot of money, which I got off of LinkedIn because there was a whole lot of people making a lot of money, and they call it playing the game. They call it, some people try to pretend that that's professionalism and collaboration, but that's definitely not inclusion, equity, and justice. That's more of the business sense, which is not the same thing as activism, voice. And a lot of people have started writing books, and I just warn people, don't follow behind everyone who's writing a book. A lot of times they're stealing information from activists and they're putting it into a book. And so that's another thing I just want people to be aware of when we're talking about inclusion, equity, and justice. There are a lot of people who will attend meetings and you're thinking that they're about to collaborate to make some changes, and they're literally taking everything to use for their own trainings. They're using it for a book that they're about to write. And then you realize, oh, there's a book release happening, and this is everything we said at that, community justice meeting. And so I just want people to be very cautious in who they welcome.
It's almost just a colonial mindset to this issue, is coming in there thinking, okay, whatever I can exploit in this situation. And I mean, it doesn't have to always be intentional, but the result is the same, is taking value away from the communities that have generated that value.
Yep.
I love that you mentioned disability. I come from a critical disability studies background, and I know disability is often the last on the list. So whenever we're going through all of our rights for this group, and persons with disabilities, or they just get categorized into other. And so the fact that you're kind of putting that into focus it just warms my heart, and I see a lot of value in what you're doing. So I want to go back to what you said a bit about professionalism, because I think one of the things I find really challenging about the way society is structured is around definitions, or who's defining these words, like implicitly or explicitly. Words like professionalism, like who is setting that standard, and how does even us using that kind of terminology marginalize people who may not adhere to that kind of mindset or approach, or however we want to define what that word is. Yeah. I wonder if you could just reflect on that a little bit and how you've seen that in your own life.
Yep. So it's interesting because I oftentimes hear people say, well, there's nothing wrong with being professional. There's nothing wrong with being taught etiquette. And then that's when I have to say there is something wrong when it's based on European white standards that have been forced on us for 529 years around the world through colonialism, through Christian missionaries, which includes universities that are Christian-based universities, when it's based on white people's version of medicines and sciences that were used and still are used to control indigenous Black people, non-white Hispanic, non-white Latin people, that was also used by Adolf Hitler for Nazi Germany. If your etiquette, professionalism, style of dress, and all of that is based on European white standards, and you don't even realize that, that means colonialism keeps being successful, because it's 100% based on brainwashing you to believe that a certain style of dress, a certain way of having your hair, a certain language is appropriate. And so I always tell people this because there's a lot of outcry when you show people images of indigenous children stolen and put into camps, put into white schools, forced to cut off hair and forced to dress in British attire. People are like, that's horrible. But I'm like, but you do that every day though. Like, you can think it's horrible because in your mind it's from a distance, but yet you shape your hairstyle, your language, how you dress in a way that you think is professional based on what white people consider professional. And also there's gender in there as well. Mm-hmm. So like when we see images of Black people, especially after Emancipation Proclamation, becoming more assimilated, and that's still based on this notion of European white acceptance. And so that's just, there's so much that goes into it, because I mean, this is all around the world. When people go into areas that are big tourist attractions, that's based on European white tourism. So like predominantly Black and brown nations that make most of their money from tourists, but guess who's in charge of the tourism? It's white people. And so I always tell people, because a sociologist termed the phrase colorblind racism, whenever people say this has nothing to do with race, it usually has a lot to do with race. It might not be obvious as far as what a lot of people are looking for, because a lot of people have now made race synonymous with racism, such that we can't be Black without now talking about oppression. Yeah. So that's one thing when I taught race and ethnic relations, I would always say race and racism are not interchangeable. Like racial identity is not interchangeable with racism. A lot of people don't recognize any of this. So when you talk about professionalism, they think that the way they dress, the way they speak, how they behave in classrooms is just based on that's just how things are. As though alien life forms, I always use the alien life form comparison, because literally people act like when people use terms like structural, systemic, systematic, like all these concepts. And I say, these are people, institutional, all these concepts y'all keep using. I blame sociologists for teaching y'all this without telling you that these are not abstract existences. They are people doing this stuff. So the things that you consider normal, if you teach a stupid etiquette class, I think all etiquette classes are really stupid. And if you say we're teaching it based on African cultures, you still have to dissect that, because is that thousands of years of Africa before colonialism, or is this after colonialism, right? Because before colonialism, in much of the world for thousands, our people are doing things that are considered sinful, unnormative now, like using hands to eat things, how we use the restroom. A lot of things that people say are dirty and horrible now are normal for our cultures. So the same thing applies to professionalism. I'll dissect where you got that idea of professionalism. For example, when people in other parts of Asia meet people, instead of hands, traditionally it might be to nod your head or to seem like you're doing a little bow. So, and that's why they tell people when you go internationally for a business meeting, know that. So if you can comprehend knowing the culture over there, know that you're brainwashed after a certain culture in the Western Hemisphere. Like,
absolutely.
We're not a neutral, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think it's fascinating, and your words are so they're just dripping with wisdom, and I really love that. And hearing you kind of point out some of the things that we just take by default, the assumptions that we just take by default. Oh, of course it's this way. How else would we have done it? Well, that default comes out of white supremacy, male supremacy, and we have to question our assumptions here. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to move forward on this issue or any other issue.
Most people don't want to move forward. So we just have to be honest about that as well.
Well, there's a lot of people benefiting from us not moving forward.
Yep, exactly.
All right. This is a wonderful conversation. I want to, one of the issues that's kind of come on my radar lately, just because I listen to a lot of podcasts and content creators that talk about these issues, is this topic of invisible injustice, and the kind of that injustice doesn't always explicitly occur in like incarceration rates, right? You know, we know that there's unfair incarceration rates in the US, but injustice can also occur invisibly to, you know, it's the way we think or the way our kind of knee-jerk reactions, our biases, these sorts of things. I wonder if you could just give me your take on that issue. What do you think? How do you think we can combat this sort of thing? Where do we go with this?
Yeah, so invisible injustice can include just learning patterns. So how we learn behavior. So as humans, again, as we always say, we're social creatures. So that's the social psychology that is used in both psychology and sociology and criminology and criminal justice, where we address how we learn through verbal, nonverbal, and that's from the moment we're born. So we talk about the learning gender, even biological sex is learned, because I keep asking people when they claim they're female, male, how do you know? Do you really know what your genitalia were or was when you were born? Do you know your chromosomes, hormones? Probably not. So again, that's what you were told and all that stuff. And so when we're addressing that, it really has to do with perspective as well. We can say it's pertaining to bias and prejudice, but I always tell people to be careful when addressing bias, because that's how those horrible implicit bias and unconscious bias training started happening. A whole lot of people are doing implicit bias and unconscious bias trainings. Yep. I despise them. And people always ask why I despise them. I says, well, the two groups that control our lives and kill us the most are always proud that they do a bias training. Guess who those are? Police departments and medical and health facilities. So I guess those damn bias trainings are not working as well as we thought, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's just something that I want people to reflect on when we're talking about power disparities, which are also invisible, right? Because people don't walk around necessarily with a sign saying power, power. And when we talk about power, it includes people who they themselves are struggling in life, but the struggle is buffered at least a little bit because they have an identity that's considered the power majority, whether that's white in terms of race, gender in terms of cisgender, right?
Yeah.
So I always tell people when you're talking about doing bias trainings and looking at bias, are you challenging power though? Because at the end of it, all you're doing is people saying, yeah, I have bias, then, okay, now what, right? So the invisibility is also very important because we're talking about the overt and the covert. Covert meaning something that's not as obvious, and that pertains to injustices and inequities. And covert can also include when people seem like they're happy with how their life is. And that's examples are when you see images of indigenous people over the centuries, and images over the centuries, oftentimes people are not smiling. Why? Because, the photo lens took a long time to take photos. So, smiling took a long time to take a photo back then. But sometimes you will see images of people looking like they're at peace. And I always tell people who say that means that people were happy. There's one thing to be happy with your family, with your culture, with your identity. And it's another thing to have to maintain happiness amidst oppressions and inequities and injustices. And so that's an example of the invisible stuff, when people are so adamant about pretending that these injustices don't exist. And they'll find the most ridiculous examples to prove that. Like they'll say, well, you have a PhD.
Yeah. Or the Will Smith argument.
Yeah. And I tell people, well, yeah. And guess what? I've been called Dr. Nigger. I've been called Dr. Cunt. So having a PhD has just added to that, because now that's an example of what we call racial threat hypothesis. When you have successes, the power majority feels even more threatened now. Yeah. So they use your success to sometimes say, well, there's no more oppression, or oppression never happened in the first place. And then sometimes they will use that to express outrage towards you, because how dare you? And that's also connected when white people increasingly say things like college degrees no longer matter. That happens over the generations, where they'll say college degrees are the utmost importance. And then when more Black and brown people get college degrees, and more poor people get college degrees, and more women, they're like, no, trade school is the most important. And that's not based on legitimate information. That's another example of skewing data. It's based on what it means when the power majority wants something to be a symbol of their power. More people get up there and they're like, we're going to let that go. It's no longer important. Yeah. And so that's another example of invisibility, because so many people think a college degree means something. And I'm like, well, look at the curriculum and look at the demographics represented in what's being taught and learned. Having a degree, if you're still taught the oppressor's information, congratulations on the degree. But now when you talk about how to dismantle a lot of what you were taught and learn factual information. So people say, I was a biology major, I learned fact. I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about thousands of years of biology. Which part of this were you taught? Usually 1%, right? Yeah. So that's also considered the invisible part, because people are never taught to challenge this notion of fact, because they're especially taught that if white people say it, it must be true. If men say it, it must be true, and especially white men. And so that's just, the list goes on in terms of that.
I love this conversation so much. I just recently joined TikTok, which has been an absolute adventure for me. But one of the things I did notice was that because of the way the algorithm is programmed, you can get channeled into some very, very niche communities. And so I've been lucky that the communities that I've ended up being kind of targeted, that the algorithm has targeted me towards, have been Indigenous rights, women's rights, LGBT rights, transgender rights. And so I'm just wondering, given what you just said about how educational systems are so structured around the existing models of white male supremacy, how do you see the social media landscape in terms of elevating more diverse voices and allowing the kind of dialogue to evolve at a faster rate than academia can kind of keep up with? I don't know if that made sense, but
it makes sense.
Okay,
yep.
Hit me.
So social media is owned and controlled. The end. No. It's still a white controlled platform, which is why many of us get banned social media platforms, because most white people are fine up as long as it ends up with us thanking white people for listening. And that's also very characteristic of most white liberals, progressives, fascists, white Democrats. At the end of it, we have to acknowledge that white people allowed us to speak and say thank you. And so the same thing is the case with social media platforms. So I always tell people, when celebrating the voices on social media, remember that especially with Black people and especially with Black women and Black gender non-identifying people and Black LGBTQIA people and Black people with disabilities, we're giving a lot of free labor on social media.
Absolutely.
Like this week and last week, the whole issue of Black people who know how to choreograph dances were having their information stolen from TikTok. So now a Black man choreographer is starting a business to help, at least an organization, to help Black choreographers know how to copyright your choreography and get contracts, instead of putting everything out there and then it gets stolen and other people make a lot of money, celebration. And you're like, I created that. So that's one of the issues with social media. We put a lot on social media. Like, I will share information about African mathematics, indigenous mathematics, because, white people love to pretend math is math. It doesn't have anything to do with race. And so I put that on there for communities, but also for teachers. However, one thing is factual. Social media has a lot of people being really good actors. On social media, they're getting a lot of clout and celebration, but they're not changing anything. Like, when they go to work, they're not doing anything. Yeah. Like, you can celebrate medical professionals for having a TikTok where they're talking about racism during COVID. But when they're at work, they're not changing the medical racism and scientific racism foundation of medical and health academic programs. They're not changing the racist, sexist, homophobic, pronatalist policies and practices at the medical and health organization or facility. Yeah. They're not changing anything that's happening at these board of directors and board of trustees. These school teachers, school officials who are all over Twitter talking about gender equity, blah, blah, blah. When you talk to them about changing curriculum and changing libraries, they suddenly are helpless and have no idea what you're talking about. And then they cry about needing their job, as though school districts and politicians can fire everyone in the system. That's not possible. But, they hype themselves up to believe that it's possible for everyone to get fired. Yeah. Which is why I tell people social media is cool, but most of you all are not doing anything beyond being on social media. Yeah. It's kind of lip service. It's exactly that. And this has happened for centuries before this technology existed. There have been other examples of people being celebrated for shouting out. And then when people say, okay, we heard you at that, please join us in doing this, then suddenly people become too busy. I tell people, if you're busy, if you have a disability, if there's anything that's keeping you from action, that's okay. But ask people how you can contribute in some way. That could be giving $5. That could be doing a virtual meeting. That could be sending out flyers, handout, or something. But unfortunately, most of these people on TikTok and Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn are getting celebration. But when it comes time to doing real hard work, get them in trouble at work and all that stuff, conveniently, they're silent. Yeah. They're outraged on social media, but they're conveniently silent when you're like, okay, grown adults, let's do some stuff. We saw you marching down that street shouting Black Lives Matter. Let's do some stuff. And then, the shouting is like all they could do now. Now they can't do anything else. So that's why I just always tell people, instead of being easily impressed, let's demand more from people. Do better and be better. It brings us to this issue of allyship. And I think that I want to hear your take on it. I have kind of a personal relationship with this issue because I have the good fortune of being able to work with a lot of, I don't know how you feel about the word marginalized communities, but I'll just use that word. And
I refrain from referring to myself as an ally because I don't believe it's my place to kind of take that mantle and put it on myself. It's something that if a community believes that I am being an ally, then they can refer to me in that way. And I'm always grateful when that happens. But I always avoid kind of calling myself something like that.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering if you could speak to other people who present with the same privilege that I present. What would be your expectations from them in terms of how they could carry that outrage through past just a talking point and into their daily lives and into the kind of the work they do, whether it's being a gas station attendant or working at a CEO as a company?
Thank you. So thank you for not putting the ally button on yourself. I really appreciate that. I do not believe in a such thing as ally. I do not believe that power majorities can be allies. And so within one person, there are various identities, which can also include a mixture of power majority and marginalized identities. So I do not believe in a such thing as white ally. I do not believe in a such thing as cisgender ally, heterosexual ally. And I started really critiquing this about 17 years ago. And then I really started critiquing this when I started going to the pride parades in North Carolina with my friend and her wife. And I was given this beautiful ally button. And I just felt so unworthy as a cisgender heterosexual woman. I understood that it was a welcome, but I don't think that power majorities need to be welcomed. Because as soon as they gave me the button, I was like, I'm an idiot, cisgender heterosexual, walking around here with the ally button, and my presence here pales in comparison because I tell power majorities, you need to be challenging your power and your privilege, like even things like men and women in a two-gender system being able to walk around hand in hand without people rolling their eyes at you, that's power. So you have to really critique. I'm not telling you be paranoid, you have to be aware to the point where it might feel like paranoia. That's the thing about power majority. You're going to feel oppressed when you damn sure are not oppressed. Like you're going to feel, a lot of power majorities want to start feeling victimized just because now you're being conscious. And I'm like, you're not being victimized. You're being forced into consciousness. So I don't believe in a such thing as power majority ally. I believe in advocates, contributors, and collaborators for equity, but it can't just be when it's convenient. It can't just be when you want to show up to a pride parade or a march or a protest. It has to be when you're sacrificing yourself in a sense, which means if you're in a board of trustees meeting, a board of directors meeting, when you're around your friends and family, when you're at work. Like as a Black woman academician, I had to eventually start telling white liberal colleagues, stop sending me emails to thank me for what I said at the faculty meeting. We're not going to go to lunch so you can congratulate me. If you can't say it there because you're afraid of losing your colleagues and your friends, then that means you are part of the same white supremacy.
Yeah.
Right? Same thing, we talk about those Black Lives Matter protests at the beginning of COVID, where white people were getting so much celebration for standing in front of police and I'm like, first of all, many of these people did not have to go to work, did not have to go to school because of COVID. It was trendy. Their friends were there. But like I said last year, a lot of Black people got mad because they said, you're so critical and you're Debbie Downer. I said, that's right, because minoritized people have a reason to be skeptical. Do not be foolish enough to abandon skepticism just because white people show up for something. Just like I learned how to be skeptical by being around more Black people who are LGBTQIA, because I would show up as a cisgender heterosexual Black woman talking about pro-Black, Pan-Africanism, fight to power. And Black LGBTQIA people are like, yes, but only if you understand how this includes all of us. And that really showed me to really understand what it means to be united without feeling like other people have to hide their identities and feeling like people have to thank you for being there.
Yeah. Or give you a participation trophy just for showing up to a march. Yeah.
Yeah. So the example I always use is, if people haven't seen the Donlin documentary that was released when I still lived in North Carolina, but it's Donlin documentary about the history of indigenous people, the original people on this Western Hemisphere in particular, and of course, how they were stolen and so forth. But Donland, DAWNLAND, that I always use for my presentations, where the white people who are helping are standing up and the indigenous people from various tribes and cultures are sitting down, and they look at the white people and they're like, you've done enough. We're now going to talk to each other. And basically that was their way of telling the white people go home, right? And the white people left. And that's one thing I tell people about being a contributor. It can't be you thinking that people always have to thank you and now everything's wrapped around you. Like, you need to be prepared to be completely ignored that's all of it, because that's really an understanding of what it means to really help people who are harmed every day and can't just escape the way you can escape as a power majority.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets into this issue of decentering oneself and recentering focus on the communities that are being underrepresented or often misrepresented. I'm wondering if you could, what kind of advice, guidance do you have for me and for people who present like me, that what can we do when it comes to that decentering process? What does that look like to you?
Yeah, so it also depends on the identity we're discussing. Is it racial identity, gender, sexuality, health? Is it socioeconomic status, political, religious identities? Because some of our identities are more obvious and some of them are more. You'd have to know about the person to know their identity. And that includes as well that are not obvious. And so generally speaking, I just encourage with a power majority that's one of their primary identities, meaning something that asks you to tell them about yourself. That's one of the first things you mention. White people tend not to mention that they're white, but that's the whole white power thing, because whiteness, just like men not saying I'm a man sometimes, depending, because this notion of being universal, objective expert on everything. But I always just tell people to just self-reflect, inconvenience yourself to learn. We have tens of thousands of years of people, trillions of people all around the world, long before racial categories existed, long before gender categories existed. And so we have to understand that just because something is socially constructed, as we say as sociologists, does not mean it's not real in terms of identities and outcomes. And be able to learn in an inconvenient, uncomfortable way without the underserved people having to teach you. Absolutely. Like for me as a Black woman, it's one thing if I'm doing a training, it's one thing when I'm a professor. But when white people come in and now they think they can stare me down and force me to explain something, that never works on me. No. And then, of course, I become labeled the angry, unprofessional Black woman because I'm not compliant. And that's the origins of that is transatlantic slavery. The Black woman, African Black girls and women, we were supposed to comply to being stolen, raped, murdered, impregnated, then become the breastfeeders for white people's babies, all that stuff. So that still exists centuries later. So those of us who do not stand in front of white people and say, let me convince you, we're considered unprofessional and divisive, right? And that's why I tell white people, when you're quiet, I can still read your facial expressions. That's one wonderful thing about being in the communities and also being a professor. We know how to read facial expressions. And we know when you have never inconvenienced yourself to be the only white person in spaces. And we're talking about going to the 7-Eleven to pick up some bubble gum. We're talking about, whereas like even things like Juneteenth festival,
Mm-hmm.
environments, you might not have ever heard of it. And unfortunately, many Black people have never heard of June because of the way history is taught and learned. But it has to be able to put yourself in spaces and research this before you go into that space so that you don't show up and now you're like, ta-da, white person is here. Why are y'all not paying me any attention? Why are you not abandoning African-American vernacular so I understand what you're saying? And then cultural appropriation comes in because white people think, oh, now I'm in your space. Let me talk like you do, yo. And they don't understand that, no, being in our space and learning about us does not mean that now you steal our hairstyle, steal our language, steal our style of dress, and start to mock us, because that's 5 centuries of white people stealing stuff. So power majorities need to understand what it means to consistently change. And you're just making your contribution in your lifetime and leaving something behind for future generations. You're never going to get rid of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. All this stuff will exist as long as humans exist. You do your part. And the problem with white people is white people have a tendency, when they don't feel like they're worshiped, to actually tell us, well, I was trying to make changes with racism, but now that you've proven that you don't appreciate me, I'm going to become a white supremacist. I've literally had white people sending me that email every week anonymously, as if now I'm supposed to beg them, don't become a white supremacist. I promise you, I'll send you the bestseller book about anti-racism. Maybe you'll learn something. No, I mean, angry white people are just going back to what they thought anyway.
Yeah.
So I tell all power majorities, if you are quick to anger and quick to threaten the underserved people, like now you're going to do a hate crime against us because we're not conforming, then you definitely are not a contributor and a collaborator.
Yeah.
You're just like the rest of them.
Yeah, and exposing their true colors.
Exactly.
One of the things I read or somebody told me recently was this idea that looks at the evolution of all the isms, right? So like I can kind of, I can try to say that I'm not racist by today's standards, or I could maybe I could put it differently. I could say that I'm not racist by the standards of a 19th century American. Right. And that would be a very low bar compared to somebody who would say that I'm not racist in the 1950s. And then that's a low bar compared to what we would say today. Yeah. And in the next generation, we're almost destined to be looked at as kind of way behind that evolutionary, the evolution of the mindset. So I just wonder if you could reflect on that. Like, what are the trappings that we can fall into as we get older and we're looking at these, we're looking at our own history, we're looking at the histories of our communities, and how could we avoid falling into being not racist for your generation, but very racist for the generations to come?
Right. So that's
to avoid that.
It is possible, but most people will not. Why? Because they're accustomed to just doing what they're taught to do, right? And so this is where I use the different concepts, the relative deprivation and absolute deprivation. So relative deprivation, some people are very familiar with this, is when you do a comparison. So a lot of times Black people, for example, will be told, do not complain about slavery, do not complain about Jim Crow, do not complain about mass incarceration, do not complain about this, do not complain about that. Do not complain about white people stealing resources. Do not complain about the curriculum being about white people, because at least it's better than someplace else around the world where your people are oppressed, blah, 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 as if that oppression is not mostly a result of white people stealing, colonializing, and all that stuff. And not just white people, but there's also that tension among Asian diaspora and on the continent of Africa as well. So I tell people, if you determine inequities based on a comparison sample, then you are not interested in true equity, because you're going to spend the rest of your life pretending that a little bit of improvement here, especially at the surface level, means that you all better shut up and enjoy life now. Everything's awesome. Right? And we're told that a lot, like Indigenous people, we're talking about just the majority of the population in the Western Hemisphere is now a tiny percentage of the population in the Western Hemisphere, relatively speaking, right? And many indigenous people identify as white, identify as Black, and so forth. And so sometimes indigenous people will be told, well, at least it's not the Trail of Tears. Like literally people will say this, right? So I tell people, do not do a comparison sample. Do not say, well, things are better than they were when I was a child.
Yeah.
And the other side of that is oftentimes white people will say, well, things were so awesome in the 1950s. Why are things so horrible now? I'm like, awesome for who? Like,
yeah,
you know what was happening in the 1950s? Most white people don't, because especially white middle class. So I tell people, don't do that comparison sample because your comparison is usually 100% false. It's narrow to what you see, and it's also narrow to the power majority writing books and stuff, teaching you falsehoods. Instead, there's no different level of oppression. Oppression is oppression.
Yeah.
Racism is racism. Sexism is sexism. Homophobia is homophobia. Transphobia is, there's no different levels. You can't say, well, I was really racist last year, but this year, just a little bit. You can't say I was really cisgender centric and, transphobic yesterday, but I learned more. So, look, and this is beyond beliefs again. It's now into actions and so forth. So I always just tell people, do not do that comparison because you thinking something has improved. Do the minoritized people think it's improved? And if so, is it often because they keep being told to just smile and accept improvements? Like Black people, we are told to smile and accept improvements. People have the audacity to tell us to smile and celebrate things like Juneteenth becoming a federal holiday. That means, and that's extremely insulting for, that to become a federal holiday as far as I'm concerned. And then we're told to celebrate white people singing Lift Every Voice and Sing. First of all, Lift Every Voice and Sing is the only song to which I stand, put my hand on my heart and sing. I don't acknowledge American flag, chanting songs. I don't want white people joining me in on that. That's another form of white power and racism, because despite Black people celebrating this forever as a collective, now it's supposed to be considered legitimate, valid, and something important just because white people say, we've signed off on it now. You people can do it.
Yeah, just another expression of supremacy.
Exactly.
All right, I want to wind up because I could just talk to you for probably another 8 hours, and I want to be respectful of your time. And I know you got big plans the rest of the day to do a whole lot of nothing, and I love that.
A whole lot of nothing.
Yeah, that's fantastic. We should all build more nothing in our days.
Yes.
All right. So I want to go back to your company because I want to get into really quick the origin story of your company and give me a big plug here. What are you doing to use that, your entrepreneurial spirit, your drive to make change happen? And what can people do to help you make that happen?
Thank you. So they can go to 365diversity.com and they can learn about the services provided. My services are results-based, which means that if you hire me to do an introduction training, it literally ends with a discussion of how to do annual assessments. So when I was still full-time faculty, I also was in charge of doing the annual program assessments for my criminal studies program. So that was part of the accreditation for the department and the college. So the same way I specialize in doing those evaluations and accreditations, I teach schools, K through 12, college, universities, businesses, and organizations how to evaluate their policies, practices, and how to collect demographic and cultural data. And that's very important because even if it's not required by law, to prove you want inclusion and equity, do it yourself. I keep telling people, stop waiting for it to be required by law to show that you truly care. And also the demographic and cultural data is important. It's very common for schools, businesses, and organizations to pretend that they reach everyone. And I keep telling them, stop using phrases like, we reach everyone, we're for everyone. And then when we actually collect data on who you're reaching, you're typically reaching the power majority. And even if you're reaching underserved people, the decision makers are the power majority. So that's like the whole savior syndrome thing. And so you have to collect the data. A lot of businesses already know the data is possible to get because a lot of chambers of commerce across the nation use GIS coding data to map out cities and counties. Guess what? That's how they get marketing information for businesses and organizations. You can map it out, find zip codes, income level. You can find where the hair salon's located. So whenever people pretend they don't know how to map out their city, they're pretending that their school, their business organization has not already done that to figure out who they're reaching. That's just one thing I tell people: do not create lies to justify the inequities. We know that you intentionally have people who work for you who specialize in finding who you're going to reach, especially if you're talking about who has the money to make profit. Yeah. So with what I do for 365 Diversity, it tears down those intentional inaccuracies that people keep perpetuating in schools, businesses, and organizations. Tear that down. So for my introduction training, you're not going to sit here and with me telling you the definition of racism and sexism. As grown people, you truly can find that out on your own without looking at Webster Dictionary. There's literally writings about this for generations. You don't need dictionary. When you get to me, you've already looked up definitions and stuff. Now we're actually discuss the issues where you're working and talk about changing policies, and then talk about how to do the annual assessments. And I also specialize in doing the Get Work Done workshops for medical and health students and medical and health professionals, changing the books that you're using. A lot of medical and health academic programs and medical and health career trainings, including CEU trainings, are still teaching that Black women have a higher pain threshold, and that they'll oftentimes, and I've attended these trainings and had to challenge the trainer, they'll say things like, well, Black women have the lowest suicide because Black women pray more and are stronger. And that's 100% false. Suicide data is based on reported information and also cause of death data. So Black women's suicidal thoughts are oftentimes not captured in data. Yeah. And so the work that I do with 365 Diversity is based on really dismantling a lot of falsehoods and changing policies and practices that are created based on falsehoods. Again, alien life forms did not create the stuff that you're abiding by in your schools, businesses, and organizations. The people who created this stuff, the people who created the curriculum, who chose the library materials, who chose the textbooks, they did that based on their idea of who are the decision makers, who are the most knowledgeable intellectual people, which is why you'll oftentimes see if there's an African studies course, there'll still be very much white people as the authors and so forth. All of that can change, right? It can change. So people need to understand inclusion means making changes and also having deal breakers. If you work for a school, business, or organization that is 100% invested in perpetuating inequities, you have to ask yourself how, if you're not changing that, now you're working there and your name is on a place that's horrible. Yeah. So I always tell people, stay on the job market. That's also what I do in 365 Diversity. I tell people, everyone working there, if you all are not happy with the problems at that school or business organization, you need to give the decision makers an incentive to change. Because if you're going to be there regardless and you're going to comply regardless, they have no reason to stop being horrible. So all of that is done at 365 Diversity. It implements centuries of activism, scholarship, policies, and practices, and all of this work beyond just smiling together and pretending that injustice ends if we just hug it all out.
I love it. I couldn't even possibly synthesize it better than you have here, but I would just say that for anyone listening, this is about holding up a mirror to yourself and engaging with that process. So if you're still in the looking up the definition stage, this is not the right product for you. But I love that you exist. I love that 365 Diversity exists, because it ups the game so much in this area, and we need that because there's so much, as you have said, there's so much just puppets talking nonsense about these issues with no meaning, no substance, and no integrity behind it. And you're bringing that in such a strong, with such a strong representation of the evidence that is behind it, the knowledge, the expertise, the wisdom that you've gained over the years. I have massive amounts of respect for you and for your work. I'm so grateful to have the chance to get to know you a little bit. I hope this is not the last time we will speak. I would love to do a follow-up in a few months and just have another chat about how life is and get to know you a little bit more.
Thank you. And please keep in touch. So contact me whenever you want to discuss. And people who have questions can, if they don't feel comfortable quite yet contacting me because they think I'll challenge them too much, they can contact you and you can just send me any information.
Yes.
It's common for people to be afraid of challenges, and especially when the challenges are from unapologetic, knowledgeable Black women. That really scares people because they, like I said, they want us to have that breastfeeding thing going on without being vocal and adamant about challenges and changes.
But look, I mean, as a straight privileged white guy, I can attest that of all the times I've been uncomfortable because I've been challenged, I've survived it somehow. It's not hurt me permanently. And it's made me better. I've grown from it. And I think there's so much value behind getting used to being a little bit uncomfortable in these spaces, because I mean, the other side of the coin, we can't even compare. There's no way to understand. We can have as much compassion and empathy as we want, but the lived experience is so different. But I just, again, Dr. Kimya, thank you. I owe you a huge debt of gratitude for taking your time. I've learned so much in this process, and I've made whole pages of notes that outside of this interview, I'm going to take, and because it's going to become my mantra, because I want to find ways of taking what you've taught me and making the people around me better. So thank you again
for working hard on this. Thank you.